This Unfold by Judith Clarke. Chapter 6, Chocolate Icing. 2002. His mum and dad had been laughing together at dinner time, so James had felt tonight would be all right. But just as he was falling asleep, the noise started up downstairs. The noise, that was how he always thought of it. In great, thick, black letters stamped inside his head. The moment he heard it, his stomach got this tight, full feeling, as if he'd had so much to eat he never wanted to eat again. His eyes snapped open and his hands shot out from the doona and clamped against his ears. There was a knack to blocking out the noise. Hands flat over your ears didn't really work. The noise still got through. You had to use your thumbs, press them in really hard, squashing the little ridges on the sides of your ears. Doors, James called them. He shut the doors. The noise blurred and almost disappeared, but it was uncomfortable lying in bed this way. After a bit, his arms began to get stiff and his ears and elbows hurt. When he took his thumbs away, the noise was still going on downstairs. He wished he wasn't so scared of it. He wished he was brave like his great-grandfather Kenny had been. Grandma Clytie had told him all about Kenny, how when he was only a kid, not all that much older than James, his dad had died, and Kenny had to go out and find work in the middle of the Great Depression to keep his family together. The noise seemed a small thing beside a bad trouble like that. He shouldn't be so scared. It seemed big to him, though, a different kind of badness. James thought suddenly, and somehow he knew Kenny had never known this particular kind of fright. Perhaps that might even be the reason he'd been able to be brave. He took his hands from his ears and the noise rushed in again. Earplugs, that's what he needed, like the ones he'd bought for Davy down at the chemist shop. He wouldn't feel right about wearing them himself, though. With earplugs, he might fall asleep, and he couldn't risk sleeping. He needed to stay awake in case something happened. He didn't know exactly what would happen, only that this was the feeling the noise gave him, a knocking like a warning in his heart that something bad would come, something far worse than noise. The very first time he'd heard it, James had been 6, a year older than his brother Davy was now. When it woke him, he'd got confused. He'd thought it was thunder, a storm coming in from the sea. Then he realised it couldn't be. There was no lightning flashing through the curtains, and the sea sounded sweet and calm. He'd sat up very straight and listened hard. When he'd worked out he was hearing his mum and dad's voices yelling at each other, fighting, he'd been so scared he'd wanted to crawl under the bed. It was a long time before he heard the noise again. He'd been almost 8 by then. Now the time between was getting shorter. He'd be 11 next birthday, and the noise was coming every second week. Davy had heard it for the first time 10 days ago. He'd sat up straight in his bed, exactly as James had done. "What's that?" he'd whispered. Davy was really little. You know those tiny kids you see starting prep each year, how their school bags look too big for them, and how sometimes you see one standing alone in the playground, puzzled, and looking around like a kidnapped person walking in a strange room and trying to work out what kind of place he's in and what he's doing there. That was how little Davy was. And he'd had that same puzzled expression when he'd heard the noise. "What's that?" he'd asked again. James hadn't wanted him to know. "It's the TV," he'd lied. "They've got it on really loud downstairs." "No, it's not." Davy had switched on the bedside light and gazed sternly at his brother. It's Mum and Dad. What are they doing?" James had been stuck for a moment. It's not as easy as you think to fool little kids. "They're practicing," he'd said at last. "Practicing? For a play. You know what a play is." Sure. Davy had been in the school nativity play last Christmas. A wise man in a long robe, his purple turban pinned together with Mum's best brooch. He'd even had a line to speak and practice. Lo, a star shines in the east. Sure, I know. The smooth baby skin on his forehead had creased into a frown. Then he'd shoved his doona back. I'm going down to see. No, don't. Why not? Because you'd interrupt them. Interrupt their concentration. What's concentration? What you need to do things properly. But Davy had slid from the bed, staring at the door, listening to the voices downstairs. The last thing James wanted was for him to go down there. He'd done that the first time. He'd crept to the bottom of the stairs and seen his mum and dad in the kitchen, looking different, like a pair of angry strangers who'd sneaked in from the street. People you didn't know at all. People you'd be frightened of. Tell you what, Davy, he said, struggling to keep his voice calm and ordinary. If you get back into bed, I'll read you a story. Davy was crazy about stories. He loved them more than anything. At any other time, he'd have jumped at the offer and climbed back into bed at once. But that night, he'd hesitated, kept on standing there, his puzzled eyes fixed on the door as if the thought of a story suddenly wasn't wonderful anymore. And this is what the noise did to you. James knew. It stopped you from loving things. He'd settled Davy back beneath the doona and read him 2 stories in a voice that was louder than the noise. And all the time, Davy had kept on staring at the door. Halfway through the first story, the back door had banged like it always did at the end of their fight downstairs, Dad going out in the car. Davy had given a little jump when he'd heard the bang. What's that? Dad just locking up. They've finished practicing and now they're going to bed, see? James prayed Davy wouldn't hear the car start, tyres crunching on the gravel, the squeal as it turned out into the road. He'd begun reading again, his voice loud as a shout, and after a bit Davy's head dropped back onto the pillow. He'd closed his eyes, but it had been a long time before he'd gone to sleep. Not until James had finished the second story and was halfway through the third. He didn't want Davy to hear the noise ever again. He didn't want him lying awake at night. He didn't want him to stop loving things. He didn't want his little brother to get like him. James has gone all quiet, Grandma Marie had said last Christmas. He's not the child he used to be. Grandma Marie made James feel uneasy. Her eyes went small and squinty when she looked at him, and though her voice was soft and she called him Lovey, he knew she didn't really like him. She didn't like his mum either. Jessica, she called her, instead of Jess, and it sounded harsh and cold. It isn't natural for a child to be so quiet, she'd gone on, spooning the pudding into their bowls. He's like a little old man, and such a long face on him. He's growing up, Dad had replied irritably. That's all. They don't stay babies forever, Mother. James hated Grandma Marie. Grandma Clytie was his favourite. She took him and Davy out to all kinds of places, and she'd promised they could come with her next time she went to Israel to visit their great Aunt Frances and Cousin Gabriel. But the thing James liked most about Grandma Clytie was the way she always saw the good in you, instead of hunting out the bad. You'll grow, she'd said when he was worrying about being small for his age. Your great-grandfather was over 6 feet, and he always said he'd been small as a boy. Was he quiet? James had asked. Grandma Clytie had thought for a moment. A good kind of quiet, she'd replied. James didn't want Davy to grow quiet. He liked the way his little brother was so noisy and cheerful, rushing, laughing through the house. He liked how Davy jumped out of bed in the morning the minute he opened his eyes. He didn't want him to change. And that's why he'd gone to the chemist shop the day after Davy first heard the noise. The chemist was the kind of person who thought kids were a joke. The moment he spotted James, he'd rushed over and leaned his elbows on the counter, grinning into his face. What can I do for you, young fella? Heavy date with the girlfriend? He'd winked at the people standing, waiting for their prescriptions. Bet this fella's after some sexy aftershave. I want a pair of earplugs. Earplugs? The chemist hooted. She's a nagger, eh? The girlfriend? Or is Mum hassling you to do the washing up? A lady in a bowling uniform frowned beneath her hat. The chemist took no notice. Or is it Big Sister's so-called music keeping you awake? Yes, James had said to shut him up. It's the music. When you met people like their chemist, you just couldn't wait to grow up. Davy hadn't wanted to wear the earplugs at first. They feel funny, he complained, and you can't hear anything except rubber. That's the idea. Then Davy's face went stubborn like it always did when he was going to say no and mean it. The earplugs were the kind that came on a band, the headphones. He'd ripped them out and thrust them back at James. I don't like this thing. What's it for? It's a dream machine, James told him on a flash of inspiration. See, Davy, when you wear it in bed at night, you have these really great dreams. Oh, Davy put them on again. Don't tell Mum and Dad, though. It's our special secret, okay? Davy grinned at him. Okay. They kept the noise out, anyway, because this very night when James pulled his thumbs from his ears and heard the crash downstairs, Davy didn't stir from sleeping. The crash was china breaking, and James could tell from the sound it made, hard and sort of splintery, that it hadn't got a person. It had hit something solid, the fridge perhaps, or the kitchen wall. The back door banged. A moment later, he heard the car start, then the skid of tyres as it took that corner from the drive. He didn't know where his dad went after they'd finished fighting. They lived in a small town. There was nothing open late at night, and everyone was asleep. He'd just drive round, James figured, and the thought of his dad out there on those long, dark roads was a misery to him. It was another thing to keep awake for, the click of the door when Dad got safely home, because what if he didn't? Or what if something happened to Mum? Or what if? The words made marching sounds like his own footsteps hurrying home from school, almost running, his heart in his mouth until he burst in through the door and found Mum safely there. What is it? She'd ask sometimes, catching sight of his face. Is something wrong, James? He could never say. That was the worst thing, almost, not to be able to say to anyone, not even to yourself. Now the vacuum cleaner hummed downstairs. His mum was sweeping up the thing that broke. When it stopped, he thought, she'll go to bed now, straining his ears for the sound of her feet on the stairs. It didn't come. Instead, he heard the soft click of the back door closing. Dad? It was far too soon for him, and he hadn't heard the car. All at once, the house had a cold, hollow feeling, and James knew he and Davy were alone. It was his mum who'd gone out the door. With a quick glance at the sleeping Davy, he crept from his bed and hurried down the stairs. The hall and living room were a dark, narrow band of light shone through the gap beneath the kitchen door. When he pushed it open, his heart beating fast because this was the room where they'd been fighting. It was full of that swirly feeling that came on nights like this, as if huge, invisible birds were flapping in the air. The room was so clean and tidy. It was hard to believe anything had happened there. All the plates and cups and pots from dinner had been washed and put away. Nothing on the kitchen bench except for a big white mixing bowl, thick with chocolate icing, that his mum had left out for Davy to scrape clean. He knew it was for Davy because Mum knew James didn't like chocolate icing now. Chocolate icing was one of the things he used to love and didn't love anymore. It was like he couldn't somehow. Where had Mum gone? James ran to the window and pressed his face against the glass. The floodlights were shining outside. She must have turned them on when she left the house. He could see the whole garden, the lawn and trees and the wooden bench where she'd often sat to read. Sometimes when she was reading, she'd glance up from the page and her face wore that same lost look as the new little kids at school, like she didn't know where she was or what she was doing. Beyond the garden was the narrow strip of beach, and there she was, a thin, dark shape against the flood-lit whiteness of the sand. It was good she was there. It was good to walk along the beach when you got upset. The sea sounded gentle, and if you walked long enough beside it, you felt better. James didn't know what he'd do without the sea. In a little while, she'd come back in. "What are you doing?" He swung round and found his brother standing in the kitchen doorway, rubbing at his eyes. For a moment he thought Davy was wearing a strange black necklace over his pyjama top. Then he saw it was the earplugs. The dream machine slipped down from his ears. "Just getting a drink of water." James snatched at the window blind to hide the garden from sight. It stuck halfway like it always did, and then he realised it didn't matter, because Davy was too short to see out the window anyway. His head only reached to the top of the sink. "I want a drink of water too! I want—" Davy broke off, catching sight of something underneath the table, something his brother had missed when he'd looked around the room. Before James could stop it, he'd grabbed it. "What's this?" he asked, holding out his hand. It was a small piece of china from the thing that broke, a thick brown smear along its edge which looked like blood. James snatched it and then saw that the smear was nothing to worry about. Only chocolate icing. "What is it?" "Just a bit of rubbish." James chucked it into the pedal bin. As the lid snapped open, he saw more pieces of china in there. Lots of them. And a cake. A whole cake, the one their mum had made that afternoon for the school market stall. It was all smashed up. "What's the matter?" Davy was right beside him, staring up at his face. "Nothing." James shut the bin lid quick. "Where's my glass of water? I'm thirsty." "Sorry." James filled a glass from the tap, and Davy drank it slowly, watching his brother over the rim. "Where's Mum?" he asked suddenly. "She's upstairs, asleep." "Oh." James couldn't tell if he believed him. Davy's head ducked down and then shot up again. "I had a dream," he said. "Was it a good one?" James heard his voice sounding like Grandma Marie's, soft and full of lies. "I can't remember." Davy put the glass down onto the bench and dragged the earplugs from his neck. He flung them down onto the floor. "This stupid dream machine doesn't work." "You just said you had a dream." "I said I couldn't remember. It doesn't count if you can't remember." He glared at his brother and then marched to the cupboard in search of the biscuit tin. While his back was turned, James snatched a quick glance through the window. Mum had stopped walking now. She was standing at the edge of the water, staring out at the sea. That was all right. "What are you looking at?" Davy spoke through a mouthful of biscuit crumbs. "Just the garden." He held his arms out. "Lift me up! I want to see the garden too." The last thing James wanted was his little brother seeing their mum out there. He'd rush out after her. He'd noticed she'd been crying. "Look," said James, trying to distract him. "Mum's left you all this chocolate icing in the bowl. I'll get you a spoon, eh?" Davy shook his head. "I don't want it." "What?" Next to stories, chocolate icing was Davy's favourite thing. "You mean you're too full from dinner?" "No, I don't like chocolate icing anymore." A trickle of fear made the bowl tremble in James's hand. "You mean just now you don't like it? Or—" Davy stamped his foot and roared, "I don't like it ever anymore." James's heart seemed to drop behind his ribs. It was starting then. Davy was beginning to stop loving things. He stared down at the bowl in his hands. That icing. It was so rich and creamy and thick, the sort of thing any normal kid would love. It seemed like such a waste. "You might change your mind in the morning." "No." James's eye slid to the window again. He had to look. He saw his mum walking out into the sea. He wanted to believe she was only paddling, dipping her feet in the shallow waves like she did when they walked along the beach together. But there were no shallow waves tonight. It was cold and windy. The sea was rough and the tide full in. Already he could only see half of her. He knew at once what was happening. The bad thing he dreaded coming ever since the noise began. The bad thing that dogged his footsteps when he hurried home from school, that made him hold his breath tight as he rushed in through the kitchen door. He was always afraid he wouldn't find his mum there, that she'd have vanished, gone away from them like she was doing now. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to rush out to her, get her back. But then Davy would follow. Davy would see. He had to get rid of him quick. "Davy, you go back to bed now and I'll come up in a minute and read you a story." He gave his brother a small push towards the door. "Don't!" Davy's small shoulders twitched his brother off. "Why are you talking like that?" he demanded, his eyes fixed on James's face. "Really fast, like gobble, gobble, gobble. I'm not hurry." "Why? Why do I have to hurry? Why do I have to go to bed?" James wanted to yell. He stopped himself. He knew if he once started, he'd yell and yell and yell, and he didn't want to be that kind of yelling person. "Please," he said softly. "Please, Davy." And the pleading in his voice startled Davy. With one quick, scared glance at his brother, he ran off up the stairs. James jerked the kitchen door open and ran across the lawn. "Mum!" he was shouting. "Mum! Mum! Mum, don't! Mum, come back!" He knew she'd never hear him, not with the wind and the roaring sea. He couldn't bear to look out there, not yet, not till he'd reached the beach. He was too afraid she might be gone. He ran with his eyes fixed on the sky, and he saw a strange cloud up there beside the moon. It was shaped like a man hunched over a fire, and James had a strange feeling the cloudman was mocking him, whispering that nothing mattered in the world. The noise and fighting, Dad driving round on the roads, Davy getting scared, even Mum walking out into the sea. "Nothing matters," the cloudman whispered, "and you're a fool to care." "Go away," James hissed at him. "I hate you. Get away from me. You're wrong." The strange cloud broke up, drifted into smoke between the stars. When James looked out across the floodlit beach, his mum was there. She was striding from the water. She was right in near the shore. In a moment, she'd be safe back on the sand. Coming back to them. The most amazing lightness swooped right through him. He felt made of air. Joy, that's what it was. Joy. In his last English test, they'd had to give a definition of joy. The feeling you get when the worst thing of all doesn't happen, James had written. His teacher, Mrs. Atkins, hadn't quite known what to make of that answer. She wasn't sure, she said, that it was a proper definition of joy. "Oh, it is," James had said. And then she looked at him for a long moment, and then reached into the drawer where she kept a box of gold stars. She'd pasted one on his test, right next to his definition. His mum had reached the sand now. She was shaking the water from her hair and clothes. He longed to run to her, hug her tight, whisper, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," for coming back to them. He didn't. He knew she wouldn't want him to know where she had been. He flew back to the house. "You took a long time," Davy yelled from his room when he heard his brother's feet on the stairs. "Are you coming now?" "In a minute. I'll be there in a sec, Davy, and I'll read you lots of stories." James paused on the landing to look through the small window there, check that his mum was still coming back. She was. She was in the garden now. It was a beautiful garden. It was a beautiful house they lived in there. And his mum looked so lovely, walking beneath the floodlit trees, even with her hair and dressing gown all sopping wet. She was beautiful. Everyone said so. And his dad was a handsome man. When you saw a photograph of them together, they looked like the kind of people who'd be happy ever after. He didn't understand why they weren't. Only it reminded him of the chocolate icing he and Davy couldn't eat anymore, a sort of waste. And he stood there. As he stood there, the moon seemed to grow bigger and brighter, brighter than the floodlights lighting up the garden and the sea. It was so bright James could make out the line where the ocean met the sky. It was like a long straight road, and along that road someone came riding, a boy on a big black bicycle. James blinked. Perhaps he was dreaming. He didn't know. The boy seemed so real, a young boy, not much older than himself, and though he was so far away, James could make out all these little details. How the boy's hair was the same sandy colour as Davy's, and his eyes were clear and grey like Mum's. He seemed familiar, even though he was wearing a funny old-fashioned jacket buttoned right up to the neck, a kind James had never seen before. The boy's breath came in small, smoky puffs, as if it were very cold on that long, straight road out there. His name was Kenny. James was sure of that. And Kenny could see him too. He was looking right at the window where James stood, smiling at him, raising his hand in a small salute. "Ride on, James," he called. "Just keep riding on." His voice was so kindly, so cheerful, that James felt suddenly hopeful and brave. "I will," he promised. Then he turned from the window, ran up the stairs and along the passage to the room where Davy was waiting for his story. And that's the end of Wolf on the Fold by Judith Clarke.